Greetings, adventurers. You're listening to The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood with me, Professor Atwood. I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to tell you about my latest journey. Don't worry, it's a safe space. I'll handle all the danger for you. I designed these stories to help you relax, chill anxiety, and go to sleep. Maybe they'll even put a smile on your face, even if it's a sleepy smile. So please, settle in, relax, and prepare to quietly drift off with me to parts known, unknown, and even some places in between. Comfortable? Very well. Let's get underway. Good evening, adventurers. I hope you're doing well. I also hope you're all cozy and settled in because tonight I'm going to tell you about my first adventure with my mentor, Professor Samson. I would soon be setting off to confront Professor P, my nemesis, who claimed to know the whereabouts of my missing mentor, who vanished mysteriously years ago. And yes, unfortunately, even scientists have nemeses. And while they're usually too busy with nefarious plans to bother the benign scientists and adventurers, occasionally one does take the initiative, unfortunately, and can cause all kinds of scientific havoc. That's where I was at the moment, preparing to confront Professor P, having to figure out how to defeat him and learn the whereabouts of Professor Samson, my old mentor. As I said before, when I first learned of his sudden and mysterious disappearance, I did try to find him. I literally scoured the globe. But I had no luck, and eventually I had to give up the search. But I never lost hope. But now Professor P sent me a missive via arrogant messenger crow, challenging me to some sort of battle or duel. The letter was quite light on details, and if I prevailed, he would give me the location of Professor Samson. Now, he could be lying, this could be a trap, and there are a lot of uncontrolled variables involved that I don't really like. But I had no choice. If there was a chance of finding Professor Samson, I had to take it. And fear is the enemy of any adventure, so you should never let it dictate your course of action. Caution is good and healthy, but fear needs to be managed. There's an old slogan, no fear, which on the surface sounds very positive, but really it's saying deny fear, which isn't as helpful. You can't just deny fear or not have it. That's impractical and unrealistic. And if you never have any fear about anything, including swimming in a South American swamp where an entire village suddenly vanished, then you may want to re-examine your emotional responses. Now, what I'm saying is that fear needs to be evaluated, comprehended, and assessed depending on your situation. But I guess understand, manage, and overcome fear is far too long for a slogan, and the buttons would never sell. Anyway, I'll tell you all about my first adventure as a young lab assistant and apprentice with Professor Samson. But first, I want to tell you about a few things. As you know, it's July, and in July and December there is only one episode for those months due to vacation schedules and planned off-the-grid adventuring. So please, enjoy this one episode in July, and we'll be back to our regular schedule in August. Now, there is also something new you may have noticed in the podcast show High Speed System Feed. That's right, we've added Professor Atwood's Sleepscapes, at my request, of course, to give you more adventures per month. These Sleepscapes are pulled directly from my adventures, with all the music and sounds we collect on our journeys. We then remix and remaster them and make them longer so you can create your own adventure in your mind as you settle in and drift off to sleep. And as always, don't forget to rate and review the show and maybe post about the show. That's how other adventurers find us. And if you want more info, merchandise, and donation and Patreon subscription options, you can always go to whitecatentertainment.com. All right, let's get back to the story. There was a lot to do to prepare for this next adventure, and there were a lot of contingencies to consider when confronting a nemesis. However, my first thoughts drifted towards Professor Samson, and what an amazing mentor he had been to me. I was a lab assistant just graduating to full scientist and adventurer, and I was still quite rough around the edges, as it were. Professor Samson took me under his wing and began taking me on his adventures in an effort to smooth out those rough edges, and in the process, he increased my scientific curiosity and sense of adventure 100-fold. I owe him a great deal. So if I needed to do battle of some sort with a thin-skinned evil scientist with an unfortunately hilarious name who was easily slighted, then that's exactly what I was going to do. I took a moment to remember our first adventure together and what Professor Samson taught me. I remember we had discovered a series of hidden ice caves in Greenland, but there was much more to that adventure, and I'll get to it in a moment. Anyway, I'm sure you've heard about how Greenland and Iceland are quite opposite when it comes to their names. It is quite true, I can assure you. Anyway, back to the adventure. Professor Samson was called in to deal with sightings of a new species of something that seemed to look like small bears, but not really, as they were also covered in a thick pelt of fur, but walked upright, so none of the eyewitnesses were quite sure what they were. And that wasn't really where the problem was. The problem was that this new species was causing trouble and harassing the inhabitants, who lived mostly on the coasts. And even when the authorities were called in, they still couldn't catch them, as these creatures seemed to just disappear and melt back into the snow and ice. Of course, their snow-white fur helped them with that. That's when the authorities contacted Professor Samson. Professor Samson prepped me about the history of Greenland on the flight. At the time, I'll be honest, I was eager and green and a little more impatient back then. I didn't see the point of learning this, but more on that also in a moment. Anyway, Professor Samson started off by telling me that the history of Greenland is a history of life under extreme Arctic conditions. Currently, an ice sheet covers about 80% of the island, restricting human activity largely to the coasts where people live. The first humans are thought to have arrived in Greenland around 2500 BC. Their descendants apparently died out and were succeeded by several other groups migrating from continental North America. There has been no evidence discovered that Greenland was known to Norsemen until the 9th century AD, when Norse Icelandic explorers settled on its southwestern coast. The ancestors of the Greenlandic Inuit, who live there today, appear to have migrated there later, around the year 1200, from northwestern Greenland. While the Inuit survived in the icy world of the Little Ice Age, the early Norse settlements along the southwestern coast disappeared, leaving the Inuit as the only inhabitants of the island for several centuries. During this time, Denmark-Norway, apparently believing the Norse settlements had survived, continued to claim sovereignty over the island despite the lack of any contact between the Norsemen and their Scandinavian brethren. In 1721, aspiring to become a colonial power, Denmark-Norway sent a missionary expedition to Greenland with the stated aim of reinstating Christianity among descendants of the Norse Greenlanders who may have converted back to paganism. It was a fool's errand. When the missionaries found no descendants of the Norse Greenlanders, they baptized the Inuit Greenlanders they found there instead. You know, Christianity and missionaries generally really aren't that particular. Denmark, Norway then developed trading colonies along the coast and imposed a trade monopoly and other colonial privileges on the area. Now, as I said, while I found this begrudgingly fascinating, despite my impatience, overall, I didn't see how any of this history had anything to do with the problem at hand. Professor Samson smiled and said all history is important for solving mysteries during modern adventures, even if they seem unrelated upon the first casual glance. He then continued with another historical anecdote. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, American explorers, including Robert Peary, explored the northern sections of Greenland, which up to that time had been a mystery and were often shown on maps as extending over the North Pole. Peary discovered that Greenland's northern coast in fact stopped well short of the pole. These discoveries were considered to be the basis of an American territorial claim in the area. But after the United States purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917, it agreed to relinquish all claims on Greenland. For instance, Professor Samson reiterated, this part of Greenland's history may not seem relevant on first glance, but he assured me it was. As I said at the time, I had absolutely no idea what he could be referring to. But even at that young age, I knew enough to keep an open mind. Nowadays, Greenland is ruled by Denmark, of course, but the people who live there, don't seem to mind, and the tourist revenue goes a long way to keeping everyone happy. But still, they occasionally have problems that Denmark can't solve, so they called Professor Samson to discover what was going on with this new species that seemed to not like humans living in Greenland. Professor Samson already had a theory but wouldn't share it with me. He wanted me to puzzle it out for myself. He asked me where we should start searching. I said by one of the towns that was being harassed. He looked at me with a slight hint of disappointment, but smiled and agreed. We set up camp to keep a lookout for these mysterious creatures just outside the town of Canuck in North Greenland. The accommodations were minimal but comfortable, and it was quite cold, as you can imagine. I'll admit this was also where I started to develop my penchant for creature comforts, even when adventuring. But a Spartan and minimalist approach to adventuring never seemed to bother Professor Samson. We set up our camp just outside of town and tried to stay out of sight, which of course meant no fire either, but we did have portable heaters that did the trick. We also had to rent dog sleds as we needed to get across the snow fast in case these creatures showed up. The locals didn't get too many tourists all the way up here, but they seemed to be getting the worst of the creature harassment, so it made sense to start here. Professor Samson had his crew, including a mercenary, a biologist who specialized in rare and unusual animals, and a scholar, so he seemed to be ready for any contingencies. We waited for hours, but there was not a sign of anything. It was quiet, save for the gently blowing wind over the frozen ground. The lights in the small town of Canuck were on, but slowly, one by one, they turned off as the residents lay down to sleep. The creatures seemed to come at night, but not always. They said there were a few brazen infiltrations during full daylight, in which various food was stolen, from pies to fish. But the residents of Canuck said they expected that from wildlife. It happens sometimes. But these creatures were so loud and so obnoxious during their raids, they seemed more interested in bringing attention to the fact that they were conducting the raid itself, rather than focusing on any plunder they acquired, which was very unusual for animals, and Professor Samson agreed. He added, with a small smile, it was almost as if they had another motive. Suddenly, we heard some odd squawking, and it woke the dogs. They began barking, and then we saw them. They were furry, walked upright, and waddled, and headed straight for the town, squawking as they went, completely ignoring us. I wondered if we even needed to bother trying to conceal ourselves. They were odd-looking animals, too small to be bears and too big and furry to be penguins. Well, what were they? Professor Samson gave me a wry smile and asked if I had any theories. I'll admit, I didn't. The unknown species reached the town and began causing a ruckus as they knocked over trash cans and went through every street, determined to wake up every person who lived in that small town. They didn't even look like they were rummaging through the trash for food. It really just looked like they were vandalizing things, which made no sense. At least it didn't to me at the time. The biologist whispered something in Professor Samson's ear, which made him nod in agreement. Then the scholar said something like, "This should not be." And even back then, I knew that wasn't helpful. Professor Samson then walked straight towards the strange creatures, and once he was in earshot, he started using the UPL, the Universal Pantomime Language, that allowed for communication with different people and cultures, and with the more intelligent land creatures. Now, it didn't work with oceanic creatures, except for sea monsters, which seemed to be an exception. Anyway, Professor Samson basically said the equivalent of, "Okay, that's enough of that. You're all a long way from the North Pole, aren't you?" That's when all the creatures stopped, glared at him warily, and that's also when I was able to get a good look at them. I couldn't quite put it together, and Professor Samson said to me, "Sometimes things aren't always what they seem." And then it clicked. I wasn't looking at a new species at all. I was looking at true emperor penguins in disguise. This was my first encounter with true emperor penguins, and I hadn't realized how large, cunning, and obnoxious they really were just yet. As you know, emperor penguins live in Antarctica, but true emperor penguins live at the North Pole and act like their namesakes with a completely unearned sense of importance. Professor Samson continued talking with them, and as it turned out, they had made a deal with the snowmen, a Yeti-like race of creatures who also live near the North Pole but are benign and mostly friendly, for a stack of white fur pelts from their discarded hair. So it was technically real fur, but not really what you would call a real pelt. But that's splitting hairs. No pun intended. These true emperor penguins had migrated, or to use their term, invaded, from the North Pole and thought Greenland would be a little warmer and a little more comfortable. And it was, obviously. But they were also rude and selfish animals and wanted the island to themselves. They were even willing to go to war with Denmark over it if need be. So they were harassing the citizens in all the coastal towns, hoping they would eventually get fed up and leave. But how did they get here in the first place? That's when Professor Samson told me to remember the history lesson and added that maybe we should have started the adventure further north. But this was a teachable adventure moment, so we followed my lead, he said. Greenland and the North Pole were indeed in close proximity and less than 450 miles away from shore to shore. I mean, the North Pole is just ice, there's no land, but that doesn't bother the true emperor penguins, of course. But 450 miles is still far for penguins. However, the true emperor penguins had found some natural ice tunnels and slid joyfully most of that way back and forth, all the way to Greenland and back. This was also why the Danish authorities could never catch them. They didn't even know what they were looking for. Now, as aggressive and annoying as the true emperor penguins really were, they did have another trait, and that was a short attention span. Professor Samson knew this and used it to his advantage, and to the advantage of all the people of Greenland. Professor Samson brokered a deal between the true emperor penguins and the residents of Canuck over some rather large mugs of hot chocolate. The residents of Canuck would give the true emperor penguins 6 full barrels of fish every year, along with some of that delicious hot chocolate, on the anniversary of their invasion as tribute if they would go home and stop trying to take over Greenland. The true emperor penguins agreed, and just as Professor Samson expected, the agreement lasted only 1 year, and then the true emperor penguins forgot all about it and were never seen again in Greenland. Now, it definitely helped that Denmark also decided to seal up the ice tunnels, but I think the agreement would have petered out on its own anyway. The residents of Canuck and the Danish government were quite grateful and gave Professor Samson a grant to study glaciers, and we were treated to the national dish of Greenland, suwasat, a traditional Greenlandic soup. It is often made from seal or whale or reindeer or seabirds. The soup often includes onions and potatoes and is simply seasoned with salt and pepper or bay leaf. The soup is often thickened with rice or by soaking barley in the water overnight so that the starches leach into the water. It is also a traditional Inuit food. Now, I'll admit it wasn't my cup of tea, and I couldn't really determine which animal was in it, but I didn't want to be rude, so I ate my whole bowl. Professor Samson and his team each had seconds. I did enjoy the Greenlandic coffee, which is a popular after-dinner drink. It typically features hot coffee, whiskey, Kahlua, Grand Marnier, and whipped cream. Served in a Bordeaux glass, the coffee is set on fire before drinking. It was delicious and perfect on a cold Greenland night after concluding a chilly adventure involving aggressive true emperor penguins out on the ice. During our after-dinner drinks, Professor Samson mentioned Christmastown, a joyful city on a hot spring near the North Pole, and that it was spectacular and recommended I go there sometime, especially during a cookie festival. Little did I know back then, my own assistant Bradley would be from Christmastown, so I would end up going there from time to time anyway. I smiled as the Greenlandic coffee and the joyful revelry warmed me inside and out. I knew for sure I had chosen the right mentor, and I was grateful Professor Samson had chosen me as his lab assistant and apprentice. It's a very personal thing, the relationship between mentee and mentor, and it needs to be the right fit. Well, you see, mentorship is a patronage, influence, guidance, or direction given by a mentor. A mentor is someone who teaches or gives help and advice to a less experienced and often younger person. In an organizational setting, a mentor influences the personal and professional growth of a mentee. Most traditional mentorships involve having senior employees mentor more junior employees, but mentors do not necessarily have to be more senior than the people they mentor. What matters is that the mentors have experience that others can learn from. According to the Business Dictionary, a mentor is a senior or more experienced person who is assigned to function as an advisor, counselor, or guide to a junior or trainee. The mentor is responsible for offering help and feedback to the person under their supervision. A mentor's role, according to this definition, is to use their experience to help a junior employee by supporting them in their work and career, providing comments on their work, and, most crucially, offering direction to mentees as they work through problems and circumstances at work. Interaction with an expert may also be necessary to gain proficiency with cultural tools. Mentorship experience and relationship structure affect the amount of psychosocial support, career guidance, role modeling, and communication that occurs in the mentoring relationships in which the proteges and mentors engaged. The person receiving mentorship may be referred to as a protege, an apprentice, a learner, or in the 2000s, a mentee. Mentoring is a process that always involves communication and is relationship-based, of course. It is a process for the informal transmission of knowledge, social capital, and the psychosocial support perceived by the recipient as relevant to work, career, or professional development. Mentoring entails informal communication, usually face-to-face, during a sustained period of time, between a person who is perceived to have greater relevant knowledge, wisdom, or experience the mentor, and a person who is perceived to have less, the mentee or protege. Mentoring in Europe has existed as early as in ancient Greek times. The word's origin comes from Mentor, son of Alcimus in Homer's Odyssey. Since the 1970s, it has spread in the United States mainly in training contexts associated with important historical links to the movement advancing workplace equity for women and minorities, and has been described as an innovation in American management. So, it was a bond not to be taken lightly. As you can see, I had to do everything in my power to find Professor Samson. I tried once before and was unsuccessful. But this time I had something to go on if Professor P wasn't lying, and this was just some elaborate ruse. As I said before, I had to take that chance. And I will tell you all about my journey to confront Professor P next time. But before I end this evening's story, I want to talk to you about something. As I've said before, sometimes you go finding adventure, and sometimes adventure finds you. While this clearly fell into the latter category, there were significant differences. One of them was that I was being taunted by an evil scientist who had become my nemesis. Professor Papadoodle. I'm sorry, I had to try it again to see if I could do it without laughing. No, we'll go back to Professor P. Anyway, sometimes you don't know what the future holds, but you do know it will contain a certain amount of conflict. And unfortunately, conflict is unavoidable in life. But that doesn't mean you have to like it or run from it. It serves a purpose. And I've said before, you'll always be stronger on the other side of it, win or lose. But there's something that can help, something that we've talked about many, many times before. Preparation. It's not just for an unknown adventure. Sometimes you know exactly what you're getting into, and while you may not be able to prepare 100%, you can put the odds in your favor. Okay, I had some tricks up my sleeve for Professor P, that's for sure, but they required preparation, and as eager as I was to get going, you can't rush preparation. And since I was currently alone, with Bradley on a much-deserved vacation, it would indeed take a little longer than I liked. But it couldn't be helped. Never confront an evil, petty nemesis half-cocked or half-assed. No. You want to dot the I's and cross the T's. You'll be better off for it, and the nemesis generally aren't expecting it. They just think you're gonna rush out and confront them. That was Professor P's first mistake. Well, not his first one, clearly, but most likely his most recent one. So prepare. Be ready. Confront your nemesis calmly, logically, and with forethought. They won't be expecting it. Godspeed, adventurers.
The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood was created, written, and performed by Chris Mancini and produced by White Cat Entertainment. It is a work of fiction. Maybe. Music and sound design by Ron Tansky at rontanskymusic.com. For more info and merchandise, including t-shirts, mugs, and blankets, go to whitecatentertainment.com.